Now we're going to bring together a panel of experts now to delve into the conundrum of local government funding. We just heard that GST to the regions is off the table under this government, but what else could be done? This panel is going to discuss the challenges, the opportunities and the potential solutions that they see to the gap in local funding. And you are again welcome to add your questions via Slido, and the moderator of the panel is going to attempt to get as many of them as possible to the panellists. So on this panel we have the Mayor of Queenstown, Jim Bolt, Sue Bidrose, the CEO of the Dunedin City Council, Heather Schotter, the Chief Executive of the Palmerston North City Council, Natalie McClue, partner at PwC as expert advisor, and this panel is going to be moderated by Ian Blair from WSP Opus. So please give our panel and our moderator a very warm welcome.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, and thank you very much for coming along to listen to the panel discussion on funding regions. Initially I'll just set a little bit of context before we hand over to our experts to answer a series of questions that have largely come through on social media, and obviously you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So local governments are at a critical point when it comes to planning and paying for infrastructure that meets the needs of today's communities and tomorrow's. They face unprecedented pressures that require strong decision making. Because our regions are the powerhouse of the nation, it's too important for the future of New Zealand not to get this right. For WSP Opus, it's also important. We have 40 offices around the country and long-standing relationships in the communities we help to build. Because we live and work in these communities, we're passionate about the improvements that infrastructure delivers. It also means we understand how unique each region is, because this is reflected in our business. There are some common themes though. Earlier this year we carried out a comprehensive study of 10-year plans and found a number of common themes, including drinking water quality is a massive issue, infrastructure is at risk from sea level rises up to an estimated amount of about $14 billion, and other issues commonly faced, including ageing infrastructure, earthquake-prone buildings, and bridge maintenance. Now, most normal organisations would have no problem in prioritising this. However, in local government, these investments quickly become political hot potatoes, and projects need wholesale buy-in from ratepayers. As one of the panellists put it, politicians have trained communities to believe that councils can deliver the exciting new stuff as well as maintain the existing infrastructure. The Productivity Commission's Local Government Funding and Finance report has similar findings and has identified the need for new funding tools in 4 areas. Firstly, supplying enough infrastructure to support rapid urban growth, adapting to climate change, coping with the growth of tourism, and the accumulation of responsibilities placed on local government by central government. So what's the best course of action? I'll call in on the expertise of the panel to help with this. So could you please join me in welcoming Jim Bolt, the Queensland Lakes District Council CEO, Heather Schotter, CEO Palmerston North City Council, Sue Bidrose, CEO of Dunedin City Council, and Natalie McClue, a partner from PwC. Jim, I might start with you. Queenstown's got the fastest growing population in New Zealand. It's got a permanent population of around 40,000 and a ratepayer population of only around 23,000. It's the undisputed capital of New Zealand tourism, with more than 3.6 million visitors a year, although some in Rotorua will obviously aspire to that. Spending on infrastructure is critical for the success of the district. The cost of providing services for visitors in the 2018 to 2028 long-term plan is estimated at $378 million. And the importance for New Zealand of Queenstown tourism is critical. So help easing the burden on ratepayers to fund infrastructure, a visitor levy has been proposed. What are some of the funding models you looked at and considered and rejected? And the proposed visitor levy is based on benefits principles. So what have been the key challenges around this?
Okay, so just clarify something for a start. We have 36 international visitors for every one resident in our district every year. On top of that, we have domestic visitors, which is roughly the same number again. So for the sake of the argument, call it 70 visitors for every one resident. They stay an average of 2 nights, 2.1 nights I think it is. So you put that in the context of having somebody staying in your house for around 140 nights of the year, and it gives you kind of an impression of the pressures that are on our district. I got elected 3 years ago to on the platform of coming up with a different funding model, and I had this great idea that I would ask government to share GST back to the regions. And as you've just heard Grant Robertson say, that is just plain not going to happen. Put that to the last government, put that to the current government, and it became very clear, understandably, that they require GST to fund hospitals and roads and schools and all the other things they do, and we're not going to get GST back. And it is of some frustration that parts of the industry still continue to ask government for a portion of the GST. We're best to get on with an argument that will work rather than one that won't work. We also looked at the Provincial Growth Fund, and you've heard Grant talk about that and the benefits it brings. The problem with the Growth Fund from our point of view is this is not a one-off grant that fixes our problem. This is an ongoing issue. We wanted an enduring model that provided funding forever and a day and adjusted upwards as prices went up and as numbers continue to grow. We therefore came up with a visitor levy. We looked at various models. Is it a levy that covers the whole industry, or as we've ended up, is it an accommodation levy? The problem with the tourism industry is it's pretty hard sometimes to figure out who's in the tourism industry and who's not. If you're a dairy farmer, you've got cows in the paddock and a truck comes and takes the milk away, you know what you're doing. A gas station on the west coast, for example, probably doesn't know it, but they're in the tourism industry. Likewise, the supermarkets in our town. We decided that if we took it wider than the accommodation industry, it got very murky. If you're going to take it wider, let's say you included attractions. Well, the biggest single attraction that's sold in our district by dollar value is Milford Sound, and that's not actually in our district. It's just that people go from Queenstown to go there. Take an Earnslaw trip across Lake Wakatip to Walter Peak, where you get the Earnslaw ride, you get a meal, you get a farm show. What's the attraction? What's the transport? What's the food? All got too complicated. If you're going to go to attractions, what about food? What do you call Fergburger? Is that food or is that an attraction? So all got very messy, and of course then you took it down to supermarkets. Well, go into one of our supermarkets and you'll find several tour coaches outside it with folk buying milk powder and chocolates and whatever else to take back home. So we came back to the fact that the only thing in our district that by and large locals don't use is commercial accommodation. So we decided upon that, worked with government around that, and I have to give credit where it's due. Current government bought into the problem that we had, understood it completely. People like Grant, but also I have to give significant thanks and appreciation to Phil Twyford, who the first time I spoke to him about the issue understood the problem and has been enormously supportive. Government said to us, if you think this is the way to go and get a referendum done in your district. We did that. We got 81% support amongst our residents for us, and we're now working our way through the process of legislation. It is a tax. It requires government's input to bring it to pass. So, long way of saying, Ian, went through various alternatives, came back to a straight-out accommodation tax as being the best way to go. There are those who would say it will damage the industry. Well, I've just returned from 3 weeks in Italy, where it's €5 per person per night, and I didn't see a lack of tourists there.
Thanks, Mayor Bolt. So, Sue, the challenges facing Dunedin City Council are different again. After decades of very limited growth, Dunedin's moved from being a low growth to a medium growth in the last 4 to 5 years, but your population's ageing. By 2028, 22% of the people in Dunedin will be 65 years or older, and this will potentially make rates less affordable for some households. Rising seas are already having an impact on low-lying parts of the city. There are over 3,000 homes in these areas and 110 businesses and 35 kilometres of roads less than 50 centimetres above sea level. There's significant pressure on the costs of delivering core services, including managing ageing infrastructure. Dunedin has several wastewater networks of pipes and treatment plants, and in some areas the pipes are in average or poor condition and need to be improved. So how have we found ourselves in this situation, where quite a number of other councils have as well, of deferred maintenance issues to contend with and a lack of willingness or limited ability for the community to pay for that work, and how do we fix it?
Yeah, so Dunedin probably is in a position that is mirrored in a number of other councils, or many other councils, in terms of deferred maintenance, and part of that is an unintended consequence, I think, of the current funding model. I don't know what proportion of the audience today is from local government, but for those of you that are, and particularly that have worked in the infrastructure area, I could probably guarantee that there's none of you that at some point in time haven't had the chief executive, the mayor, councillors say, seriously, can't you just put off that pipe thing because we need to build a new rugby club rooms, we need to put in new cricket pitch, we need to put in new lights, we need to do the things that get our politicians elected. And at the same time, we have got rates pressures, and every annual plan, every long-term plan, I watch 2 queues of people come to council, one lot saying don't put the rates up and the other lot with a shopping list. And those two things they're mutually incompatible. Because of the way local government is currently funded in terms of rates, any increase is immediately apparent. And I just want you to mull on some figures. We at Dunedin City Council, I think our rate rises are probably reasonably typical across the country. I would bet most of you would have seen the letters to the editor yelling at local government about the fact that every year we're doing rates rises that are ahead of inflation, yelling that our rates rises are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%. And in my area, certainly yelling that how are we so out of control when government only ever puts taxes down when they run on tax cut platforms, and yet we inexorably put up the rates. And I would imagine if I asked for a show of hands, most of you would think our rates rises have outstripped the government tax take for many a long year. In actual fact, when I compare our rates revenue since 2000 with government's tax take annually and look at the increase, since the year 2000, the government tax take increases as a percentage has outstripped our rate take in 13 years. We've outstripped them in 5 years, all of them during the GFC, and we were equal exactly once. In fact, since 2012, the government tax take has increased by 39%, and up until 2018, the last year that figures were available. At the same period, our rates take has increased by just about half that. And yet people aren't hammering down the doors saying, how come are you lot so much more efficient than the government? What they're saying is, why do you increase rates so fast, so much faster than government increases taxes? So the system by which we charge rates, it's not you pay 1% of your house's value as rates, because if it was that, as house values went up, our rate take would automatically go up and we wouldn't have to do every year a 3%, 4% increase. But because it's so transparent, our rates increase is so transparent, we end up getting a lot of pressure to contain that, and that means politicians who get voted in by doing things, by appealing to the population, nobody gets voted in. I can tell you this right now, no one in Dunedin is running on a platform of, I really like what the current lot are doing and I want to be just like them. Nobody runs on that platform. Despite the fact that we're now a medium growth city, the city is growing incredibly faster than it has since the 1800s, apart from a little blip after World War I and a little blip after World War II, and we didn't have to have a war, which has got to be good. So despite that, still it's let's find the negative story, and so let's politicians are mindful to try and keep the rates rise down, and that means that it's easy to not invest in the invisible things. And in particular, that's water. NZTA forces us to invest in roading. We don't have that same model around water, and so it's been very easy to just put off the upgrade. It's not going to burst in the next year, is it? Seriously, can't we do that in a couple of years' time? And I think a lot of that, finding ways to manage that for chief executives to keep our councils happy, is part of why we've ended up in the situation that we're in.
Thanks for that. Heather, there's a real sense of optimism in the Palmerston North City Council 10-year plan. Your city appears to be thriving and poised to flourish. Over the next 5 years or so, over $1 billion will come into the city and region for infrastructure. It's a major freight and logistics hub for the Lower North Island. It shifts 6 times the freight of Taranaki and 2.5 times as much as Wellington. As such, developing infrastructure will enable even greater opportunity. The Council's largest single investment in the plan was the wastewater treatment plant, a key investment that future-proofs core infrastructure for a growing population and to enhance the environment. How do you build flexibility into your long-term plan for large magnitude of surprises, whether they be natural disasters or awful events such as we saw in Christchurch recently?
Well, thank you very much, Ian. So yes, over the next 5 years, but I think more telling is the growth that's been predicted over the next 10 years. So that's between $3 to $4 billion worth of investment coming into Palmerston North and Manawatu, just in those 2 TAs over that time. And that's a combination of both private sector investment and government, public sector investment. And so for us, that's it's a good problem. Growth is good, but growth is good if you manage and plan for it correctly. And I guess from that perspective, we have the benefit of other regions and cities' hindsight in terms of how we're going to front foot that. So $500 million of that investment is our own. Of new capital in core infrastructure to prepare for that growth. We are taking a very planned approach. So during our LTP, so 10-year plan deliberations, we developed a spatial plan and we consulted on that at the same time. So that was a spatial plan for our city, and it very clearly outlined where we considered those areas of growth to be. So we've given very clear direction to the market in terms of where our business and commercial growth is, where our housing areas are, where our city catalyst projects are going to be, and then our Manawatu, our waterfront, our Manawatu River framework in terms of biodiversity and recreational use. So we've been very, very clear about that. We've been very clear about our strategic goals. All our funding is directed towards those strategic goals. Nothing can be out of scope from that perspective, and we take an approach of making it very clear on anything that goes up to council what's in scope, and if anything creeps in that's out of scope. So the other thing is that we have a relentless focus on delivery, because what we've got to do, I think, is give confidence to the market that we're able to cope with that growth. So we have undergone an organisational transformation. It's the largest that's taken place in the last 30 years, but actually this growth is the largest that's taken place in 30 years. And so our organisation has to be fit for not just purpose now, but actually fit for the future. So that means lifting the capacity and capability of our own organisation, bringing in the best talent we can possibly afford, both enhancing our internal talent, but also bringing in external talent, including those from outside local government sector, to really bring in that relentless focus on delivery. And that's great on its own, but actually unless you change your systems and processes, those people will be frustrated because nothing will change. So we're also reviewing all our systems and processes. We're really open with our customers. We're very customer focused. We're moving to an agile environment, so we're sort of moving at pace because we do believe this is all about confidence. If you want the private sector to invest, if you want government to invest, you've got to give them confidence that as a council that you can deliver, and we're certainly doing that. The other thing that we're doing is collaborating with our regional partners, and I've heard a lot about that both this morning from the Minister and yesterday, and we think that's really important. We started that, and look, I've only been there 2 years, so in my brief time there, we started that with the Manawatu Gorge. So when you talk about sort of a natural disaster, when the gorge, the Manawatu Gorge is closed for transport, it was a key road for us. We are a logistics and transport hub for the Central North Island. So we as a region collaborated to provide our input into NZTA deliberations on what we believe the best route was. Now, you know, NZTA see that very much as, and did see that very much as eroding, you know, point A to point B, as they do and are mandated to do. We saw it as a regional economic transformation project. So for us, it was quite different. It was about unlocking the potential of the lower half of the North Island. And so all the TAs formed an alliance, I guess, around lobbying on the best alternative. And as part of that, we've been able to front foot our regional freight ring road, which will be a significant investment and will unlock the potential around our airport to be a multimodal transport hub of rail, road and air. We've now moved on from that, if you like, and looking at Three Waters, and we've been working on our response to government's deliberations on Three Waters. We will have a regional response to that. We really want to be in control of our own destiny, and to do that, you've got to front foot things. And I know that we believe in order to get that sort of attention and that voice, we've got to collaborate as a region. Spatial planning has been mentioned. As I said, we did a city spatial plan. We're now embarking on a regional spatial plan. So from Ruapehu in the north, the northern TA, to Horowhenua in the south, and across to Whanganui and Tararua and all in between. And looking at how do we take what we did and then actually overlay that with the whole region and our priorities. So being very, very clear about where we're going as a region in the future, what the hotspots are, and making sure that we're not doubling up on things and we're not, you know, we're all sort of singing off the same choir sheet, if you like. And what we believe is by that we will attract more partnerships, more investment and more intention. And I think what government is looking for and the private sector is looking for, as I say, is that confidence, and that's what we want to give them.
Thanks Heather. Natalie, PwC has said that new approaches are needed to bridge the infrastructure funding gap and sees this as an opportunity to reform the way infrastructure is funded and financed. Listening to what the panellists have had to say, what's the role of alternative funding mechanisms to bring forward infrastructure development where councils face balance sheet constraints? Mm-hmm. And what role can value analysis and capture play now and in the future planning system?
Yeah, thank you. Look, it's interesting, isn't it? You listen to the panellists, and also just from the conversation over the last day and talking to local authorities around the country, and it's really clear that all of the local authorities have different challenges. So there needs to be a huge toolkit of tools that we can use to start to accelerate and bring forward the provision of infrastructure. And you talk about balance sheet constraints, but in New Zealand we've got a few high growth councils who are constrained from a debt capacity perspective. We've got lower growth, we've got negative growth councils, and they might not technically be debt constrained, you know, but as you've heard this morning, the sheer size of the infrastructure investment that's required is huge, and we simply can't pass that on to ratepayers right now, and you heard Sue say that earlier. So I think it's really important that there is a toolkit of funding mechanisms available. There are some available in the existing construct. There's things like, so under the local government funding agency framework, for every $1 of revenue you get, you can borrow $2.50. So tools like targeted rates, development contributions, they make a difference because you can finance against them and help, you know, pay for some of that infrastructure. The difficulty with those tools, of course, is they're relatively short term. They're set over a short period, and what we're talking about with infrastructure is it's intergenerational. These are long-term assets, and our funding focus needs to change so that it is long-term. Minister Robertson made the point that, Jim, you were able to bring a funding tool forward and they were able to support it. But not all local authorities in New Zealand have the ability to identify a funding tool. So being able to provide that toolbox is important. And Heather, you made the point around private sector investment. So in New Zealand, so PPPs have become a little bit of a dirty word, but private sector investment, PPPs, contracts like Boots, where you're bringing in private capital, it's not a funding source, but it is a financing source, and it helps you spread that cost of infrastructure, take that burden off ratepayers today, and perhaps use those tools to accelerate bringing forward infrastructure. There are a number of considerations, as you said, to make those sorts of tools work, but I think they are really important, and we shouldn't forget about those sorts of things in the toolbox. Minister Robertson mentioned SPVs, and of course what he's really talking about is off-balance sheet treatment. And that's really important in particular for our high growth councils. Now, at PwC, we've done a lot of work in this area in the last year. We've looked at contractual models. We've been working with the credit rating agencies on contractual models around things like water as well. And there are some real green shoots. You can achieve these things, but they're complicated. You need a hypothecated revenue stream. You need that real certainty around revenue. You also need these to be completely distinct, completely separate from local authorities. And of course, what that means is that councils need to get their heads around the fact that if you're going to go around off-balance sheet treatments, you need to be comfortable with the fact that someone else is going to own or at least control these assets for a period of time, and also that there is a charge that needs to be set to fund the infrastructure assets that's distinct and separate from rates. So there are some challenges, I think, for local authorities to get their heads around to use these SPVs, but they're a really important tool in the toolkit, and I know that DIA and Treasury are doing work on other options there as well. In terms of value capture, another thing that I think is an important tool in that toolkit, quite often when I talk about value creation and value capture, people roll their eyes at me. It's sort of we've heard that it might fund 5%, it might fund 20%, but what does this really mean? And again, at PwC, we spend quite a bit of time talking about value creation and capture. And the reason for that's really simple. It's because if you can identify the benefit that comes from the infrastructure, you can identify who benefits, that conversation around who has to pay for it and how you capture some of that benefit becomes a lot easier. Now that's all good in theory, but I guess one of the things we have done recently is our chief economist, Jeff Cooper, has done, I believe it's the first report of its kind in New Zealand, which is a retrospective look at CRL in Auckland. Now, CRL is obviously not complete, but what he's done is gone back and looked at what's happened to land value uplift since the CRL announcement was made. And it won't surprise anybody to know that in certain areas around the core infrastructure that's going to come in, there's been really significant land value uplift. And of course what that means is we've now got some of the data, we've got some of the tools and techniques in New Zealand for local authorities to be able to understand the true impact of infrastructure. What value does it create? When does it create that value and who benefits? So from a planning perspective, it means you can think about infrastructure, you can think about how you want to capture that value, and that might be quite strategic. It might be, right, I've got a piece of infrastructure, before I announce it, I'm going to purchase key land within the sort of key beneficiary areas, the catchment areas, and capture that land value uplift on day one. Or it might be using tools like targeted rates or levies so that you can capture some of that value at certain points in time to certain beneficiaries depending on when they're receiving that value. So another really important tool in that toolkit, but I think incredibly important that we are looking at all of these different funding mechanisms, making them available for all different councils, because it's got to be fit for purpose. It's not one size fits all, so they've got to be available so that people can pick and choose as needed and as appropriate.
Thanks, Natalie. Some great options there. Now, I've had some questions come through on social media as well as Slido, and one of the ones is related to, I guess, just the point you just raised, Natalie, is should large-scale flood defence or coastal erosion works be paid for by the regional council or central government, or potentially one other source. And that's come through from Paul on Instagram. So might start with you, Sue.
It's important to remember that when people say paid for by council, what they mean is paid for by ratepayers.
Indeed.
And ratepayers are taxpayers. So the question really only is, should this be paid for by people in the immediate surrounding area, a slightly bigger surrounding area being regional councils, or the whole country being taxpayers? It's not the councils that pay. You see there's a tendency when people don't want to pay for something, they say the council should pay, and when it's important to remember that's actually ratepayers. Look, climate change affects this is definitely the biggest issue on the table for Dunedin City Council. As you said, in South Dunedin alone, we've got 3,500 houses less than 50 centimetres above sea level, and we've got regular flooding, increased heavy rain events, a 1960s system that's functioning as well as it ever has, but it's not designed to cope with some of what we're getting now, and many tens of millions, if not hundreds, to upgrade that. And at some point in time, that part of town will be unlivable, but we've got absolutely no idea when. So there's some hard decisions about how long do we keep investing. What I know is that's one of the poorest parts of, well, certainly the poorest part of Dunedin, one of the poorer parts of town, of the country, and that group of people can't afford to pay for that work. So there are hard discussions to have right across the country about how we address these kind of things, and that does need to involve everybody, not just the people in those isolated communities involved.
Jim, you have a view?
Well, being a landlocked district, if we start to have coastal erosion in our area, the entire country's in the poop. We are seeing rising lake levels, but at this stage, it's not obviously an area, it's not really an issue for us.
Yeah, I maybe wasn't referring to Lake Wakatipu raising and flooding out Queenstown, but more generally the issue of funding and where that burden should sit.
Sue makes an enormously valid point. There is this great, council will pay for it. Well, that means ratepayers are paying for it. And, coming back to the funding of these things, there's been talk about debt being raised. Yes, councils can raise debt, but if you take our council, for example, our 10-year plan requires a spend of about $1 billion. That means our debt goes from a current level of around 80 million to 450 million. And, there is a point in time where good old prudence plays a part and you can't take on any more debt. So at the end of the day, after you've exhausted other sources of funding, it comes back to putting up your rates. And again, in an area like ours where for the last 2 terms before I was elected, council had this fixation on not increasing rates, it's false economy. It is simply like not putting oil in the engine of your car. One day it goes pop, and that's it.
Very good. I've learnt my lesson, so Heather, I won't ask you about coastal erosion. A question, actually, from one of my colleagues, Tom Burkett, who believes that despite competing priorities, councils must accelerate the decarbonisation of their infrastructure and communities and move towards biodiversity net gain. His question is, what gaps and challenges do you see in financing this, and what do you think can be done to overcome them? Heather, do you want to have a crack?
Sorry, I was looking the other way. Hoping you weren't looking at me. I think this is an issue, again, for all councils to grapple with, whether it be climate change or whether it be biodiversity, whether it be reducing our carbon levels, and we've got certainly a measurement, a goal within our 10-year plan that we as a council are measured on, and taking steps ourselves and how we reduce our carbon footprint. But it's something that I think that we're all wrestling with, and ensuring that we invest appropriately at the right time. We're lucky as well that we've got a university in our city, Massey University, so we're working quite closely with them, and will continue to be as a area of science excellence and environmental excellence. And I think regions like ours that are lucky enough fortunate enough to have that sort of expertise on their doorstep we can certainly use. And we're using in a collaborative way, and although you didn't come to me about climate change, we recognise as a region, while we haven't necessarily got the issues of rising sea levels, some of our partners do across the region. And so again, this is an area that we're looking at as a whole region on how we address some of these issues, and that's certainly been led by our regional council, Horizons, and working with some of our partners like iwi and Massey and various others.
Thanks, Heather. Jim, Queenstown's environment's critical to its ongoing success as a tourism mecca. Thoughts on decarbonisation and biodiversity?
Look, big issue for us. A lot of comment about carbon emissions by aircraft, which make up the bulk of the tourism industry around the world. Recent studies indicate that the total carbon emissions by commercial aviation is in the order of 2% of total emissions, so that's a useful figure. However, more locally, we had an increase last year of 19% of the numbers of vehicles on our roads in our district. We're trying to address that by a much better public transport system, and made some real gains in that, had a roughly 5-fold increase in passenger numbers on our public transport in the last 2 years, which I think is phenomenal. But here we are living in one of the most attractive parts of the world. Why wouldn't we have the most attractive public transport system? And so you come to Queenstown Lakes District for the experiences and for the sheer beauty of the place, but wouldn't it be nice if we also had the most amazing energy efficient public transport system? And we're starting to think about what we might do in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Natalie, PPPs, do they offer a solution for local authorities, or is the scale not sufficient?
Look, I think this goes to Minister Robertson's point in the and sort of the narrative we've heard the last couple of days, that it is, I think for PPPs it's around scale, so maybe it's around regional collaboration. But I think that's really important, because once you bring scale, you bring the private sector, you bring innovation, you bring capability, you attract talent to the region, because there's a bit more to do. It becomes a bit more interesting. You can have a pipeline of work there. So I think there's merit in PPPs in terms of looking at some of these regional programs of work. I do think, however, that there's also merit in what I would call non-capital led PPPs, which is these private partnerships with local authorities on some of the smaller programs of work. And if you've got especially if you've got a long-term plan, which you're all talking about, then it's easier to bring the private sector in, and you start to bring that innovation in at the same time.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that's come in on Slido is how can we reduce the focus on cheapest price procurement, which is driving the race to the bottom and jeopardising New Zealand businesses and I dare say quality? Sue, you got a view on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I was thinking of that actually specifically in regard to the PPP question, is we really have, as a sector, struggled with apportionment of risk. And we talk about PPPs as if it's a dichotomy. You either do it as a PPP or something else. But actually, I don't ever build stuff. My staff don't ever build stuff. We do it hand in hand with the private sector. We do it generally by tendering, and we have there's a pendulum that swings in terms of where risk sits. And lowest price conforming, we have tended to think of it as in the risk sits all with the private sector, and it has made people go broke. In actual fact, also though, there's some risk that is left with us, and that the private sector will find ways to cut corners so that they still make a profit on this thing that they won by having a low cost, and they cut corners in areas where it's not visible to us until something goes tragically wrong, and then it's difficult for us to hold the can for it. I think that pendulum is swinging somewhere back to the middle. I think most councils, lots of councils, are wrestling with different models of how we tender and how we procure in a way where risk is shared and benefit is shared. There's some really innovative work being done, even in tiny councils. Central Otago are doing some really innovative stuff around risk sharing and pricing that involves money going back at the end of the contract if certain things happen, or extra money being paid if other things happen. And so there are definitely innovations happening in this space, and that's encouraging, I think, for both the private and the public part of this work.
Great, thank you. So we're running short on time. Any final comments from the panel on funding, Sue? Jim?
Look, probably just an observation. A bed tax works well for us. It doesn't work well for a lot of other parts of New Zealand. And I think what's come out of this from our point of view is that funding infrastructure across the regions is very much a tailor-made exercise for the particular region. And it's a matter of striking the model that fits a particular area. So definitely not one size fits all.
Yeah, excellent point. Heather?
Look, I would endorse Jim's comments. I think they're exactly right. I mean, accommodation levy for us wouldn't, at this stage, be something that we would be pursuing, but we're interested in other forms of funding and financing some of our larger infrastructure projects. You mentioned our wastewater treatment plant, which we have to upgrade. We've provisioned 130 million. That's the lowest cost option. If our community decide they want something else, it's 250 to 600 million. I mean, we can't on our balance sheet at the moment fund something like that. So we're already thinking, you know, about the what ifs and trying to design a model that would suit us, so that we are planned and prepared for that should that occasion arise.
Thanks, Heather. And Natalie?
Look, I mean, I'd echo Jim's comments. I think the point to me here is that it's not one size fits all, but it's also really important that when these tools are created, all the work that you've done on your bed tax, that it's able to be shared so that these can be easily replicated, that we add some framework around this so there's ease of use and ease of other local authorities to be able to pick all this stuff up, so that we're not just designing something that's fit for one region only, and so that it does become a toolkit, that it's far more flexible.
Thanks, Natalie. Clearly there's no silver bullet, but equally no shortage of innovative thinking on how we might work with both within local government and with central government on funding alternatives. Can I thank all four of you for your insights? Sue, Jim, Heather, Natalie, thank you very much. Can you join me in thanking the panellists?
Thank you.